Welcome, and so glad that you're here for another mental health and wellness chat. I'm Madison, the counseling associate, and today I'm here with a special guest.
Hi, I'm Sarah. I am a crisis case manager and an LPC associate.
Nice, so happy to have you here with us. So today we're going to be having another, like always, a real conversation about the emotional challenges that students face, and we're going to discuss navigating them. So, today specifically, we're diving into what survival mode really means. It's not just about being busy or stressed, it's a state where your brain and your body are stuck in constant alert, reacting to life like it's an emergency. You might feel numb, overwhelmed, irritable, or exhausted, but you still keep pushing through because you feel like you have to. So, before we get into our discussion about survival mode, I did want to just take a few minutes to just talk about Sarah's role as a crisis case manager, kind of ask her a few questions just in case any of our listeners do have an interest in that field or that role. So, Sarah, talk to me about what it's like being a crisis case manager.
So, as a crisis case manager, I am meeting with people who might be experiencing suicidal thoughts or homicidal thoughts. They might be having episodes of psychosis, or maybe they're just on the brink of experiencing those symptoms
Mhm.
and having a mental health crisis. And so, what I do is, I talk about risk factors and we talk about protective factors, and we really try to determine what kind of things are going on, both their mental health and the environment around them that is causing them to have a mental health crisis. So it's really a lot of problem solving and just trying to make a recommendation for what steps would be appropriate for them to take next. So that could look like getting into outpatient mental health services or even psychiatric hospitalization.
So it sounds like you're, meeting people in a very vulnerable state of their life, a lot of crisis situations obviously happening, and you're just helping them take it step by step to get back on a better path.
Absolutely. It's really just about providing support for people who really need it.
Yeah, absolutely. So what would you say is a, typical day in your role as a crisis case manager?
My typical day just looks like responding to calls from jails, schools, hospitals, even calls from law enforcement or in the community to respond to people who are needing a mental health screening um, so that I can make that recommendation.
Okay, awesome. So it sounds like you collaborate with a lot of different, areas in our community.
Absolutely. We try to, go everywhere and anywhere where needed, really.
Sounds like always something new,
Absolutely. Yeah.
never a day that's the same. So do you like that kind of
Yeah, it's
changing up?
exciting.
Yeah,
Yeah,
nice,
and you get
awesome.
to help people, so it's awesome.
Absolutely. Okay. And obviously, I am the counseling associate here at Victoria College. So just in general, opposed to my role as a counselor, would you say are the differences between a counselor and a crisis case manager?
Yeah, that's a great question. Being an LPC associate myself, I had to ask myself that question
Hmm.
too. I'd say the biggest difference is whenever you are doing crisis work or crisis case management. Like I said, there's a lot of problem solving. You're meeting these people for the first time, and in crisis case management, or at least in my role, I don't have clients that I see on an ongoing basis.
Hmm.
I kind of see you for a mental health screening, make a recommendation, and then pass you along to an appropriate department or agency. um, so looking at that versus counseling, counseling, you have time to build rapport with your client and really go at the client's pace. I would say it's a big pace difference.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds like your role as a crisis case manager is more short term versus a counselor who might spend, multiple sessions with someone over a course of weeks, months, years. So, like, you're kind of one of the first stops in their journey to getting, back on their like a path towards like healing and improved mental health, kind of.
Absolutely,
Yeah,
yeah.
nice. Well, I appreciate you talking about those differences, kind of giving us some insight into what your day to day looks like. So, hopefully, if anyone is interested, that can kind of give them an indicator of like, okay, maybe this is something that could be for me. So, love it. Okay, so now that we have briefly talked about, Sarah's role, we're going to get into the conversation about survival mode. So, we're obviously throwing this term around, it's gets used pretty frequently, but whenever we say someone's in survival mode, what do you feel like that actually means in real life?
For me, if I'm thinking of someone living in survival mode, I think that you're already experiencing a crisis. Um, So, yeah, I think they're synonymous for most people.
Mhm.
Again, I think it's important to point out that experiences are different for everyone.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. And sometimes, it can feel like stress and survival mode have some, commonalities, but there is a difference between the two at the end of the day. Can you kind of speak on that difference?
yeah, there's definitely some overlap between experiencing stress and being in a crisis or living in survival mode. Um, Maybe that looks like experiencing trauma and chronic stress that's causing you to experience a mental health crisis or feel like you're living in survival mode. It's definitely different than just having a bad day. Um, So, with survival mode, and I know we'll jump more into the physiological parts of living in survival mode, but just to point out the difference between having a bad day and living in survival mode, I would say you're not able to think rationally, you're not able to think critically, you're having difficulty kind of bouncing back from stressful or traumatic situations.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a huge distinction because a bad day is something that, happens every once in a while. It's temporary, but whenever we're in something like survival mode, it feels like this is just a prolonged experience that you're going through that is having such a huge impact on you, both mentally and physically.
Yeah, it
So,
definitely
absolutely.
impacts your functioning.
Yes. And, whenever we are in survival mode, there is a physiological response that, our brain, our body is going through. What are your thoughts on what that kind of process looks like?
Yeah, so I think living in survival mode is a lot like being stuck in fight, flight, or freeze. Um, and so your body's nervous system is naturally designed to protect you in situations when you're in danger. And so that's when ideally you would go into fight, flight, or freeze mode to protect yourself. Now, when you get stuck in that mode, I think that's maybe when you get into living in survival mode or being in a mental health crisis. And instead of returning to baseline, you're stuck.
Yeah, absolutely. And because whenever we are stressed, our body does go into fight or flight mode, but then we typically, get over it, we calm ourselves back down, and we're able to get back to our normal, day to day functioning. But whenever it's survival mode, it generally feels like there's no break in between. It's just this constant, like you said, fight, flight, freeze response that you're going through. And it really can impact, our work life, our personal life, just functioning in general is so much more difficult.
Absolutely. I mean, imagine feeling like you're in danger 24/7 constantly with no sense of safety. That would be draining.
Yeah, it's like there's always some kind of immediate, challenge, something that you're trying to respond to. You're just trying to prioritize the most basic things that will help you, get through each day, survive each day. It's it sounds like a terrible experience, honestly.
Yeah, truthfully.
But yeah, so, now that we've kind of talked about some of those differences between stress and survival mode, talked about what that response looks like, now I kind of wanted to speak to what survival mode looks like in a college student, what someone might be doing or might not even be doing whenever they're in survival mode. And one example that comes to mind is, making it to your classes. You're physically there, but as you're in class, you're having a really hard time concentrating. You kind of find yourself, zoning out, and you make it to the end of the class and you're like, oh my gosh, I haven't been able to retain a single thing. And, it's weird because, like I said, you're physically present in that class, but your mind is going through so much. And, our ability to like remember and problem solve and think rationally is just kind of out the window in a survival mode state. So it really does make focusing and being present so much more difficult. Um, and so you can see how if you're constantly going to classes and you feel like you're not retaining that information, that throughout the course of a semester, it can be easy to kind of start falling behind, not performing well, and that can really impact, your college experience. So that can be really difficult.
Yeah, it sounds like going through the motions without knowing why or making sure that those motions are meeting your needs.
Absolutely. And, another example could be not being able to relax, whenever we're in survival mode, like you were saying, that fight, flight, freeze response, our body feels so tense, it's hard to kind of wind down and relax because our mind might even be racing. So even whenever we have that free time, it just feels like uncomfortable. Like we don't know what to do with that free time, that downtime, because we're so used to being so tense and keyed up, and everything always feels so urgent. So that difficulty relaxing is definitely something that can happen when you're in survival mode.
Yeah, I think it's important to point out both the physical symptoms and mental symptoms of living in survival mode. So the physical symptoms could be, feeling fatigued, a lot of what Madison said, difficulty sleeping, changes in appetite, muscle tension. I mean, think about the impact of stress long term on your immune system. Taking a look at the mental health symptoms, that can look like brain fog, memory issues, anxiety, um, depression, even irritability or becoming angry, difficulty managing your emotions.
Yeah, so like you said, not only does it have a mental impact on you, but physical as well. And that's why living in this kind of state of mind is so becomes so unmanageable and difficult to function effectively. If we're always having trouble remembering things, if we're also always feeling like we have so much tension, we're not sleeping well, all those factors coming together can make, like we've just been saying, it's just so hard to function and to be present and to have time for those meaningful experiences in our life, things like self-care, things like connecting with others, you know, those kind of go on the back burner because it feels like we don't have any capacity for anything outside of getting through each day, surviving each day. And so it's hard whenever we aren't able to engage in those things that do bring us joy, that are meaningful for us, that kind of help fill up our cup, so to speak. So physically and mentally, it has such a significant impact on us, and I think it's important to recognize that because there's times whenever we might say, "Oh, my head hurts all the time," or I have a lot of stomach issues, and it's some people don't realize that conditions like survival mode and even other mental health conditions can make those physical symptoms happen for us.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned, having headaches and different symptoms because I think the symptoms can be different for everybody, and so that's
Absolutely.
that's worth mentioning. And that's why it's also important to check in with yourself every now and then and see how you're doing. Have a conversation with yourself and be kind to yourself.
Yes, absolutely. It's so easy for us to kind of keep going through all these things that we experience. Whenever we have so much on our plate, it feels like I can't stop and kind of pay attention to what's going on because my responsibilities aren't going to get taken care of. But having those check-ins with yourself to actually say like, "Hey, how am I doing right now? What am I feeling, mentally, physically? Is there anything I can kind of do to help work on this and help me just cope better with what's going on?"
Yeah, absolutely.
It's easy to get stuck in this state, but just remembering that there are things that you can do to kind of help work yourself out of it.
Sure, yeah. I
So
mean, your body is also, as much as it's designed to protect yourself when you're in danger, it's also designed to calm down, return to baseline, and so um, there's some steps that can be taken to help you activate that part of your nervous system.
yeah, and it's, easy to get stuck in these patterns like we've been saying, but there's also ways to unlearn them and
Hmm.
to go about things that are more, functional for you in your life. So absolutely. So another good thing that can be, important to talk about is just those weeks whenever, we're running on caffeine, we've had 4 hours of sleep, and we're just going through a lot of panic. And, a good question could be, is this survival mode? And, just looking at, these, circumstances, I think that there is definitely a potential for survival mode to occur because it seems like if something's going on for a prolonged period of time, then I think that is definitely different than just your usual stress. If you're going for weeks without, adequate sleep and you're always feeling maybe anxious and panicked, and then I'm sure that caffeine is only adding on to that anxiety and panic, then, I'm kind of curious, like, what is going on in your life so frequently that is contributing to these circumstances? And, if this is a long term thing that you are experiencing, like I said, it definitely sounds like survival mode could be what is going on. Whenever I think about this happening maybe once or a few times every now and then, okay, maybe I wouldn't be as concerned. But whenever I think of this happening for weeks or maybe even months on end, then that's kind of where my red flag goes up of like, this could be survival mode. What are your
Yeah.
thoughts on that?
I definitely agree. I think we all have those mornings where we had terrible night of sleep and we need
Yeah.
coffee to get us going in the morning. But when that becomes a daily, weekly, monthly thing, you're definitely starting to look at living in survival mode.
Yeah, so there's definitely a big difference between, like you said, every now and then I need this, versus like I can't go without this because I'm literally going to fall asleep because I'm running off of 4 hours of
Yeah.
sleep. So that is, yeah, I think that could be a common experience that college students do face because whenever they have so many classes, they have all these deadlines and assignments. It can feel like everything is so urgent and that you're just trying to survive each day, each semester. So it's understandable why people could fall into these patterns, but it's just realizing like, okay, if that is you, let's just acknowledge that's what's going on and maybe we can try and figure out how to get back on track because that's not a helpful way to go about life.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So sometimes, survival mode, it can be subtle or it can be really obvious. Like we've said, it just really depends on the person. It can present in different people differently. So, what are your thoughts on, survival mode coming in subtly or being really obvious? Like, why do you think that happens?
So I think that maybe there are subtle warnings, um, like running on caffeine all the time or always getting terrible sleep. And it might not be that obvious at first that you are living in survival mode or experiencing a mental health crisis until the last minute. So yeah, I think that the signs can be subtle, and that's why recognizing the warning signs of a crisis and what a personal crisis to you might look like is really important because recognize warning signs, you're more capable of participating in intervention and preventing a full blown crisis from happening.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you speak to kind of some of the more subtle signs. Are there any obvious signs that someone's living in survival mode? Like, what do you think that would look like?
That's a good question. I think, like you said, if you're not able to not have some caffeine for the day and you're crashing and burning, that's an obvious sign.
Yeah, for sure. I think some other obvious signs could be someone who is maybe extremely irritable all the time, or maybe they just feel like they they're not really expressing a lot of emotions. They're kind of numb. Or, just like we said, that constant, sleep difficulties, that tension. Those can be some things that we hear people complain about more often. And we don't really attribute, mental health conditions to that sometimes. But looking back at things, you could be like, oh, hey, that was actually me in survival mode. I didn't even realize it at the time, but that was my experience. So yeah, it can definitely show up, either subtly or in obvious ways. And some people are better at kind of hiding those things than others. With a lot of mental health conditions, they say people can be, high functioning, and maybe that could be someone who presents survival mode in more subtle ways and you wouldn't even be able to tell because they can kind of go on and take care of what needs to be taken care of, but on the inside they really are going through a hard time. So like we said, everything is so individualized and everyone has different experiences. So absolutely.
Sure. I think, it's important to ask yourself why you're living in survival mode or why you're experiencing a crisis. And I think for a lot of people that can come down to lack of safety, lack of supports, limited use of or lack of coping skills. And so specific examples of that could be experiencing abuse or trauma or re-traumatization. Um, Maybe you don't live in a safe environment. Maybe you don't have people you can talk to when you need to.
Yeah, there's so many different ways that survival mode can come about. Like you said, maybe you went through a lot of traumatic experiences. Something else that comes to mind for me is like maybe having a really stressful or demanding job where every day genuinely does feel like a challenge and like things are so immediate and need to get done at such a fast pace. um, and yeah, like you said, whenever you don't have that support, when you don't have that ability to kind of process what you're going through and you just keep moving forward, then yeah, it's understandable why survival mode does come about. you know there's so many different ways that it can happen.
Yeah. Actually, a big part of doing a crisis assessment as a crisis case manager is developing a safety plan with clients. And so, when we create a safety plan, the first thing we're looking at is warning signs. Are you able to identify the warning signs of a crisis so that we can, again, reach out for intervention, try to put a stop to it before it happens? The other things we look at are coping skills, supportive people, both professional and personal supports in your life. We take a look at how to create a safe environment around you. So that could be securing lethal means sometimes. We also look at next steps to take, things to live for. So we're really trying to create a sense of purpose.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds like a really thorough process that can kind of help get them back on track. And, in so many of our episodes, something that myself and our other counselor Brittany have talked about is just gaining awareness, like you said, with those warning signs. I think that's the best first step to kind of help you understand like what is going on in my life that is contributing to, this state of survival mode that I'm living in. Is there anything I can do about it to kind of help reduce the impact that it's having on me? So I think in your role, you have such an important role to help them kind of brainstorm that. Like you said, problem solving is a big part of your job because it feels like you might not have a lot of control when you're in the moment, but I'm
Mhm.
sure when you're sitting down with those individuals, you're helping them see, there are a lot of options that you have. There are things that you can do to feel like you don't have to live in this constant state of crisis. So I really love that you brought that up because it is such an important job.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, safety plan is a huge part of crisis assessment.
Yeah, absolutely. So, another thing that can be common whenever people are in survival mode is kind of experiencing numbness or dissociation. And this could sound a little bit, confusing. Like, why would that happen? But if you remember us mentioning earlier, while fight or flight are the more common responses that we do think of whenever we're going through something, challenging, traumatic, whatever it may be, there is also that freeze response. And sometimes whenever we're going through something that feels so incredibly overwhelming, our body and our brain go into this freeze mode where, it feels like, okay, we can't run away from this, we can't fight back. So I'm going to freeze you, like basically like you're a deer in headlights. You feel
Yeah,
like you can't move, you can't say anything. And essentially what that is doing, it's helping, kind of protect you from that mental and that emotional pain that these overwhelming circumstances, these traumatic circumstances are, bringing onto you. So it does sound kind of weird, but yeah, it is a very protective mechanism that can kind of reduce, maybe that pain, that fear, that anxiety that you're going through in the moment, and just kind of helps you function to the best of your ability in that way.
yeah, to literally survive.
Yeah, to get through that moment. And, it can feel frustrating because you know that you want to do something, you want to try and get out of the situation, but that's what your brain and your body have made up their mind that this is what is most effective for the situation. Um, and whenever we do kind of become numb, it is hard because while it can protect us from those more uncomfortable emotions, like I said, the fear, the anxiety, the pain, it also does kind of limit our range of emotional experiences, even those that are, you know, meaningful or maybe looked at as good emotions. So like something like joy, excitement, that feels harder to access whenever we are experiencing emotional numbness. So that is kind of the frustrating thing. It doesn't only block out those more uncomfortable emotions, but also the meaningful ones as well.
Yeah, that's a good point to make. I think when you're living in survival mode and you're stuck in fight, flight, or freeze, like you're talking about,
Mhm.
the part of your brain that allows you to think rationally and critically is being overpowered by the part of your brain that's designed to protect you. So I think that most people kind of get stuck in this process of, or this pattern of reacting versus taking the time to respond appropriately.
Yes, absolutely. Our thinking is impaired, our memory, our decision making, because the part of our brain, it's called the prefrontal cortex. It's essentially known as our thinking brain. And it basically goes offline in these situations whenever we have to go into this fight, flight, freeze response. So it really does make it difficult to, respond effectively, to do what we would like to do because we feel like we can't access, that in these difficult moments.
Hmm.
So it is, yeah, it's very interesting how it has such an impact on the cognitive aspect of things. Absolutely. So now that we've kind of talked about some of these, symptoms, what survival mode looks like, I wanted to kind of talk about how people get there. Like we said, there's so many ways that we can get into survival mode, but what does that process actually look like? So, one example could be, like I was mentioning earlier, maybe you have a demanding job where there's a lot of deadlines, there's a lot of expectations and pressure put on you. So, if you're going through, those experiences on a day in, day out, it can feel really difficult to kind of turn that switch off and to kind of get out of that constant state of demand, even whenever you're at home when you're supposed to be relaxing and decompressing. It feels hard because you're so used to being in this, you know, fight or flight mode where everything feels so urgent and intense that whenever you're in a more calm environment, it can feel really hard to navigate and confusing. Additionally, there could have been a point in time where you feared for your safety, or maybe you are currently fearing for your safety. And if you never really addressed that and kind of just kept moving forward without processing it, it can be hard. You can get stuck in that survival mode. So there's lots of different ways that it can happen. Is there anything that comes to mind whenever you think of like how we get stuck there? Any kind of examples?
Actually, one thing I recently learned was that the part of your brain that we were talking about that puts you into fight, flight, or freeze mode and operates on emotions doesn't have the capability to remember things, if that makes
Mm,
sense. So if you're experiencing similar environmental cues that mimic a time where you were actually in danger,
yeah.
that part of your brain is telling you you're still in danger. It doesn't have the ability to say that's just a memory.
Yeah, absolutely. It feels like even though this might have happened 5, 10 years ago, it feels like that threat is just as high today. It can't
Hmm.
tell the difference between time and space ultimately. So,
Absolutely.
yeah, it's a great point to make.
So, Madison, can just being super busy all the time or constantly feeling behind throw you into survival mode?
So, once again, I'm looking at things from a time perspective. When you say all the time, that's sounding like a prolonged period of, just challenges, stress, whatever it may be. So, if we're, always busy, I think that's going to contribute to someone feeling constantly overwhelmed, which is most likely going to be frequently activating that fight, flight, freeze response that we've been talking about, which, like we know, can contribute to a lot of those physical and mental symptoms. And, it just creates this cascade of impacting our functioning. Like we said, that tension, that ability to not think clearly. And if we're constantly making ourselves busy, yeah, I can definitely see how that can push us into survival mode because we're not able to take those times to calm down, recharge, take care of ourselves, spend time with those that are important to us. So I definitely think it has the potential for putting us into survival mode. Additionally, whenever we're always feeling behind, I can also see how that can contribute to a lot of, anxiousness and feelings of overwhelm, which can once again activate that same, fight, flight, freeze response. And it might lead to us even pushing ourselves harder than necessary, trying to catch up from these expectations that we feel like we're falling behind on. And that could look like not being able to take time for rest, abandoning self care, hobbies, and spending time with others. So, once again, if this is something that's frequently happening for you, then I would say that there is a high potential for survival mode to be going on in these circumstances.
Yeah, it sounds like it doesn't always have to be one big event. Sometimes it can be a bunch of small experiences over time that continues to build, maybe that we chronically avoid, and it just becomes too much to handle.
Yeah, absolutely. It's easy to think of one big event like some, traumatic experience that you had that could cause this survival mode to kind of get put into place. But it really doesn't have to be one big thing. It can be, like you were saying, a variety of smaller scale, events or stressors all coming together. And if you keep going through life without taking the time to kind of slow down, like process what's going on and the impact that it's having on you, then yeah, I definitely think that there's why some people stay stuck in survival mode even whenever the pressure should be over. And whenever I think about it, as we've kind of been talking about the brain, trauma does have an impact on our brain. It can rewire a lot of things in our brain, such as our amygdala, which is it's kind of helpful to see that as like our body's fire alarm that goes off whenever we think that we are experiencing a threat, or even if we just feel like there's some kind of threat to us. So that amygdala, that fire alarm, it becomes a lot more active than it normally would in someone who maybe hasn't experienced trauma. And so whenever this, part of our brain becomes more sensitive, it makes us feel like we are always scanning for threats. So that really can put us in this hyper vigilant state of always being on edge, always feeling like the other shoe is going to drop. And so if we've gone through these traumatic experiences, our brain has kind of gone through these changes as well. It isn't easy to just snap out of it and be like, okay, even though this trauma is over, I'm going to be, calm and regulated all the time now. Like it's a process that we have to work towards. It's not easy to kind of get back to that baseline of calm and safety that we had prior to the trauma. So so it makes sense why, just because you're not experiencing those overwhelming circumstances anymore, that you can't just snap out of it and, get back to functioning as usual.
Yeah. And I think it's very easy to place blame on ourselves or feel shameful about being stuck in survival mode versus, let's say, thriving. But I think it's important to remember that life is hard. We're all humans. And things like social media and, seeing everyone live the quote unquote perfect lifestyle online can contribute to feelings of shame when really you got to be kind to yourself just like you would be kind to others. Be patient with yourself, and reach out for support when you need it.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that you brought up social media because it is so easy to get into the spiral of comparison, and it does feel like we're looking at everybody's highlight reel of life because
Hmm.
normally we don't show if we're going through a hard time or if we're experiencing mental health difficulties. We might not be as vocal about that and put that out for everyone to see. So it is easy to kind of be hard on yourself, beat yourself up about living in this constant survival mode. But like you said, I think self-compassion is a very helpful step towards giving yourself that grace that you do need, because at the end of the day, this is your body trying to help you survive these difficult circumstances that you are going through. And I think that's a really important point to make, is just reminding yourself that survival mode is essentially, like I said, a survival response. It is not a failure. So please know that this doesn't make you weak or less than because you are in this kind of state of survival mode. It is genuinely a natural response to overwhelming or traumatic situations. Our bodies are wired to protect us from the threats that we face in our lives. At the same time, it's completely valid to not want to keep feeling like you're running on autopilot and, wanting to get back to your authentic self, because this really does take a lot out of you. It really does have an impact on your functioning. But just acknowledging that this might be where you are in survival mode, I think that's the first step. But yeah, like we said, that compassion is so huge because it can be hard. But like we said, there is ways that we can, get back towards our authentic selves and function more effectively. Absolutely.
I think a good question to ask is, what would you say to someone who feels like they've been in survival mode for so long that they don't know what normal feels like anymore? Do you want to speak on that, or do you want me to give my
Why don't you
thoughts?
go ahead and give me your thoughts if you don't mind? We'll
Okay.
see what I can.
Well,
Yeah.
I would say create your own sense of normal, right?
Yeah.
Um, Take small steps to do things that you feel like are going to be beneficial to your mental and your physical health. Create a routine, because when we do things that are familiar, we feel safe. And lack of safety is one of those things that can lead to living in survival mode. So if you can begin to address that and create your own sense of normal, I think that would be the best steps to take.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a valid, thing to say, is like I don't even know what normal is for me anymore after I've been in this state of survival mode for so long. But, it's just like you said, getting those routines back and just finding whatever normal looks like for you. And just like we said earlier, not comparing your situation, your healing journey to anyone else's. as long as you're making steps to get out of the survival mode, I think that's the most important thing at the end of the day, because it can feel really hard to get out of survival mode. You can almost become used to survival mode, and trying to get out of that can feel so overwhelming, because I think a lot of things in our life come down to not wanting to leave our comfort zone because it feels so scary and overwhelming. So just taking that step to be like, hey, I'm in survival mode right now. I can recognize that this has had a protective function for me, but it's not how I want to keep living my life. So I think taking that first step to recognize this is what's going on and trying to get back on track and find a new normal, whatever that looks like for you, I think that's extremely brave. And yeah,
It's worth noting that you do not have to do it alone.
yeah, absolutely. And that's, like we said, we'll kind of get into some resources here at the end. But yeah, absolutely. Whether that's talking to a friend or a family member or even a counselor. Yeah, if you don't want to go through this journey by yourself, there are definitely people who are out there that are willing to talk to you. So, just on a general note of counseling, there are some circumstances where it is recommended that you do seek counseling if you are experiencing something like suicidal thoughts, anxiety or depression, you feel like you're going through the motions, or you're just feeling disconnected. I would say that it is highly recommended that you seek counseling, because there is a difference between, being sad and actively wanting to die. Like you were saying earlier, there's a difference between, having an off day versus having the mentality of, I just need to get through this week, but you're telling yourself that every single week. So it could, if you're feeling like every day is a struggle to keep up with the demands and the threats that life is throwing at us, then, maybe counseling would be something that is recommended for you to help you kind of figure out what's going on and how you want to find that new normal in your life. Absolutely.
I think also if you're having concerns about whether you are a danger to yourself or others, that could be considered a mental health crisis. And so, in those moments, it's important to reach out to your personal and professional supports. So, that can look like calling 988. It can look like reaching out to your local mental health authority and your local crisis hotline, which we'll provide at the end.
Yeah. And, just as a general reminder, this podcast, it's not therapy. It's not intended to be a substitute for therapy. Our goal at the end of the day is just to kind of have these mental health conversations that can hopefully help you, increase your knowledge of some of these topics that we are talking about. And if you relate to them, just once again, know that you're not alone, but know that there are resources out there. So, for example, us at the BC Counseling Center, we do offer free services for all enrolled students. If that is something that you're interested in, you're more than welcome to give us a call, shoot us an email, or stop by the counseling center. And just know that, we're available to talk to you if that's something that you're interested in. And would you mind sharing some crisis resources?
Absolutely. So if you find yourself in a mental health crisis, again, you can call 988. You can also reach out to the local crisis hotline for the Victoria area, which is 877-723-3422. You also have the option to go to your local ER. You can go to the main office for the local mental health authority, which in Victoria is going to be Gulf Bend Center. Or you can call law enforcement if you feel like you're dangerous and you don't have access to the other options that I've discussed.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing those resources. These crisis situations can come on suddenly and whenever we're feeling most vulnerable. So having access to those resources, I think, is very important for people. Absolutely. So, Sarah, I really wanted to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to come and talk about survival mode. I really enjoyed getting your perspective on things as a crisis case manager. So I just wanted to say thank you for stopping by. I really appreciated your perspectives.
Of course, I'm happy to be here. I think it's very important to talk about mental health.
Oh. So I think that wraps up today's episode. So I wanted to just say thank you for joining us in your go-to space for honest conversations about mental health and well-being. Sarah and I are glad that you spent part of your day with us. Remember that taking care of your mind is just as important as taking care of your body. Be kind to yourself, reach out if you need support, and know that you're never alone. Until next time, take care and take a deep breath.